wanted to have a conversation about cybersecurity leadership. And as we go into this, I don't know necessarily what role you may play in your own organization. Maybe you are the senior cybersecurity leader. Maybe you are the IT leader, but you have responsibilities for cybersecurity, or maybe you're in a different department in your organization, but you work with your cybersecurity team. Regardless, as we go through, I have some thoughts I wanted to share with you about success in cybersecurity. And as you'll see, a lot of success in cybersecurity, from my experience and observations, comes from the approach that the cybersecurity leadership takes in the organization. And I felt so strongly about this. As Jeff said in the intro, I spent nearly 9 years as a chief security officer with 2 publicly traded companies, and for the last 12 years have been back in a consulting role. And in those 9 years, got a lot of the scars on the back that those of us in cybersecurity get at times as you try things and they don't go the way you want, or you learn a lot and you adapt and things like that. But in the 12 years since, as I've looked at other cybersecurity leaders and seen them, there's a few things that have jumped out at me. And I felt so strongly about some of these things that I felt compelled to write a book. And what I'd like to do is offer a copy of the book to each of you guys today at no cost. And at the end of our short time together, I'll provide a link, and I'll make sure that Jeff has it for the show notes as well, so he can put it in the chat. And if you would like a copy of the book, I'd encourage you to let me know, and I'll be happy to send it to you with my compliments, and hopefully it may be helpful to you or the security leader in your organization. So as we get started, I would ask you to think about this. Are you happy with the cybersecurity function and the cybersecurity posture of your organization? All right, so start by thinking about that. If the answer is yes, that's great. I would say keep doing what you're doing. But if the answer is or no, then I would offer up this thought. And what you see on the screen there, if we always do what we've always done, we always get what we've always gotten. And so you've got to be willing to say, hey, if I'm not happy with the way things are today, probably got to change a few things if I want to see the outcome be different. And so to that end, there's really 3 major things that cybersecurity leaders need to do to be effective in organizations. And you'll see the first one is cybersecurity leaders have to earn credibility. We're going to talk about how you do that. Secondly, they've got to have allies in the organization. And then thirdly, they've really got to focus on making sure that the message resonates with the audience and that it hits home. And then in our last few minutes together, I've got a couple of other tips for success that I'll share with you that might also be helpful for you in your role. So first thing, when it comes to earning credibility, one of the biggest mistakes that cybersecurity leaders make is, since we live in the cybersecurity world all the time, we typically only think about cyber. And so we're motivated to say, man, this makes a lot of sense to me, and this is really risky and all of that. And so it's really easy for us to see the perspective that we're trying to convey. But what we have to understand is that in the big scheme of things, cybersecurity is just one risk that's facing our company. And it's just one of the factors that go into the decisions that the people who hold the purse strings, the CEO, the CFO, and others have to make when they're factoring in what they need to do. So to be successful in cybersecurity, we have got to understand what is driving our company's business. So what is it that your company's in business to do? And how does your cybersecurity program facilitate accomplishing those objectives? Okay, so unless you are in the business of cybersecurity, cybersecurity is not a key objective of the company. And we have to make sure we don't fall into the mentality of thinking that cybersecurity is a key objective. What is a key objective is what the company exists to do. And in most cases, by the way, companies exist to return value to the stakeholders, right? And to deliver good services or products to their customers. But ultimately, the owners hope to get value out of the company. And so we've got to make sure that we're thinking in terms of, how does cybersecurity contribute to the creation of value? And when we can make sure that our messaging is in line with that, it will make it much easier for getting others on board with the cybersecurity program that we're trying to move forward, or the initiatives that we're trying to get support for in the organization. One of the other big mistakes that I see cybersecurity folks make a lot is saying something like this: well, it's not a matter of if, but when we're going to get hacked. Now, those of you who spend most of your time in cybersecurity know that that's probably technically true because of the fact that all companies have humans and humans are fallible and all this other stuff and those types of things. But put yourself in the shoes of a CFO who doesn't speak the geek speak like IT folks and cybersecurity folks do. If you're telling a CFO, it's not a matter of if, but when we're going to get compromised, what's to keep the CFO from saying, well, if that's the case, if it doesn't matter what we do, we're going to get compromised. Why in the world would we spend additional money on cybersecurity? Why don't we just wait till we're compromised and then we'll deal with the fallout? And so what we don't want is we don't want to undermine our message by trying to say, well, it's not a matter of if, but when. So instead of doing that, what we ought to do is take advantage of newsworthy items to let our company know, hey, this is what we can do to avoid making sure this is us. And I'll share a specific anecdote with you. One of the roles that I held when I was the chief security officer was with a company in the hospitality industry. And at that point in time, there was a publication, many of you may know it. It was called Computer World Magazine. And I remember it was about 2 months into my tenure at this company. I'd just arrived in my role, and the brand Marriott was on the cover. They'd suffered a major cybersecurity breach. And by the way, this was not the one a few years ago. This was several years ago, but they'd suffered a breach. And so I took I made some photocopies of the article itself, and it was on the cover, so of the cover. And then I took my letterhead, that brand new From the Desk of Mark Burnette letterhead that I was so proud to have, and I wrote a handwritten note to the CEO, the CFO, the COO, the Chief Legal Counsel, and our head of internal audit. And I made 5 copies of it. And on the note, it just basically said, hey, I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, but you may have read about this recently. And I wanted to let you know that I'm going to be working over the next few weeks to understand exactly what happened to our competitor and do everything I can to make sure we're not in that position. And if you have any questions about that, I'd love an opportunity to meet with you. And so I took it and I put it in their interoffice mailboxes. And the point wasn't to try to get an audience with those 5 folks. And as a matter of fact, if you're curious, none of the 5 reached out because of that. But what it was to do is to remind them, hey, I'm here. You've invested in this role, and it's our job to make sure this doesn't happen. And I'm going to need your support. And so it was really laying the groundwork for later on. I knew I'd be in front of them. I knew I'd be asking for money. I knew I'd be asking them to think in terms of risk and make some difficult decisions about investments and things like that. And I wanted to be greasing the skids so that conversation would have some relevance. So do take advantage of other newsworthy events to remind your coworkers, your superiors, hey, we don't want this to happen to us. And so that's why these investments we're making are really, really important. The other thing about credibility that is really important for cybersecurity is that conversation must be at the highest levels in your organization. And if your organization has a board, that conversation needs to be happening in the boardroom. If you don't have a board, it needs to be at the C-level. If you are a cybersecurity leader and you do not have access to that boardroom or to those C-level folks in the way that you should, then that should be one of your most singular focuses, is trying to get access to that. In my case, I'll tell you the story of how I did. This was a number of years ago. And these days, all the publicly traded companies and many other organizations, it's a regular discussion in the boardroom. But back at the time of this story, it was very uncommon for there to be a cybersecurity discussion in the boardroom. So what I did, I knew that our chief legal counsel was the secretary of the board. And so I went to him and I said, hey, how would you feel about putting the discussion of cybersecurity in one of the board meetings in the future? He was like, I don't know. We don't normally do that. I know, but our board members, they probably want to hear what we're doing. Our company's going to be making some investments. It's probably a good idea to let them know. Well, I don't know. I'll think about it. Okay, great. No problem. My next call was to our head of internal audit. And I told her the same thing. Hey, how would you feel about maybe having a discussion on cybersecurity at the next audit committee meeting, which of course is a subset of the board? And she said, I think that's a fantastic idea. I tell you what, I'll make some calls and see if I can make that happen. Well, who do you think she called? She called the board secretary, the chief legal counsel. And she said, hey, I was thinking we ought to put cybersecurity in the next audit committee meeting. Our audit committee might like to hear about that. And he went, I was just thinking about that. That's a great idea. Yahtzee, we're in the room. And so that was an example of one way to leverage some relationships and really get people on board with the idea that it was important to have that discussion at the highest level so that the senior leadership team knew what the risks were facing the organization. And when you get that opportunity, when you get that audience, don't make the mistake of speaking pings, packets, ports, and firewalls, because most senior level folks don't understand the technology speak like we do. And if we stay in the geek zone the whole time we're having that conversation, what's going to happen is these folks are probably going to feel inferior, embarrassed, because they don't understand what we're saying. And ultimately, they're going to tune it out and they're not going to invite us back. So you've really got to make sure that when you get that audience, you have a short elevator pitch, and that you've really worked on the messaging of that so that you're speaking in the right terms. Keep in mind that there's probably nobody in your organization that understands risk, the concept of risk, better than the CFO. Now, they may not understand cybersecurity risks or the details of that, but they certainly understand the concept of risk. So they're going to be an advocate as long as you can talk in terms of business risk and how the cyber threats pose business risk. And one of the things that I did that first time I got that audience was, the first thing I did is, as I put what I thought I wanted to say together, I actually prepped it with my wife. She doesn't work in the IT field at all. And so I wanted to get some feedback from her. If I started speaking, going through what I wanted to say with her, and she's going, I have no earthly idea what you're saying, then I knew, hey, I don't have the messaging right. Well, once I got the feedback from her and I adjusted my message a bit, I then went to my boss and I prepped it with him. And then I went to that head of internal audit and said, hey, here's what I'm preparing to say. I want to make sure that this is kind of, and I went through it, and I got some additional feedback on how to make sure the messaging would resonate with our board members. And it ended up being quite effective. As a matter of fact, so much so that, as it happens, 2 of our board members were CEOs of other organizations that had recently experienced breaches. And so, as I was saying, going through some of the materials and talking about some of the risk reduction efforts we wanted to do and some of the investments the company needed to make, one of the CEOs spoke up and said, man, I just want to say, I really wish we'd had these conversations at my company. We're living through a breach right now, and it's a huge pain. And I want to give a lot of accolades to your company for making these investments and for putting you in this role. And at that point, then I was going to get whatever I asked for, right? Because it had been endorsed by one of the board members who was respected in living through it. So one of the really important things, get that message the highest level as you can, and give those senior executives a chance to understand why cyber is important. So once you've got that, once you've built some credibility in your organization, you're going to need allies. As cybersecurity folks, we cannot be the only ones talking about cybersecurity. Well, one of the mistakes that we sometimes make is, when we hear something that sounds like a risky idea, we say, oh, no, that's a bad idea. We should never do that. Here's the deal. You know as well as I do that if there is an initiative that is going to increase revenues or reduce costs, make money for the business, it's going to happen whether the cybersecurity guy wants it to happen or not, right? We need to acknowledge that. And so if we get in the business of trying to say no to stop these things from happening, what they're going to do is quit coming to us and asking for input. They're going to cut you out of the discussion and go around you. You don't want to be in that situation. So instead, what you want to do is say, all right, this is going to happen. I don't love it, but how can I use the resources at my disposal to manage the risk to an acceptable level? And I'll give you an example of that. And this is a dated example, but hopefully it'll resonate with you as well. In another one of the roles that I held as a chief security officer, the organization that we were working in at the time, this will tell you when it happened, but again, I think it'll make sense to those of you, especially who've been in IT for a while. Back then, there was an instant messaging platform. It was the most popular instant messaging platform. It was AOL, Instant Messenger. And so we had a business unit that was using AOL Instant Messenger to communicate with their clients. And of course, from an IT security standpoint, that was a complete mess because it involved installing an agent on the desktop that wasn't an agent that was built for enterprise or anything like that. It had all these security holes. It was all the time being patched by AOL, and it was just a huge mess. You couldn't do any encryption of communications. You couldn't archive or anything like that. And so when I learned about it, my first inclination was to call the CEO of that business unit and say, what the heck are you doing? But instead of doing that, I took a breath and I waited and called him and said, hey, I understand you're using this messaging client. Can you tell me what you're trying to accomplish? And he said, yeah, well, we're the fastest growing and most profitable business unit in the company. And one of the ways we've done that is instant communication with our client. And he said that our clients really like that because we might be on the phone with one, but they can still be texting with the other one. And of course, these days we call it presence, right? But they the clients could quickly see whether your dot was green or red, whether or not you were sitting at your desk. And he said, and they love that. And so they're really giving us good feedback about that. And so I said, okay, I understand what you're trying to accomplish here. Well, as it happens, our company at the time was using Lotus Notes. And Lotus Notes was an IBM product. That was our mail platform and our collaboration platform. Well, Lotus also had a tool that integrated with Lotus Notes called SameTime. And as it happens, SameTime had a messaging client that included AOL integration. So what I ended up doing was going back to the business unit leader and saying, hey, let me show you what I'm trying to accomplish from a cybersecurity standpoint. And I explained to him the risks of the AOL Instant Messenger client. I explained to him that we had this SameTime client that was already paid for and licensed by our company, so it wouldn't cost him a dime. But that if we could roll this out to replace the AOL Instant Messenger and uninstall the Instant Messenger client, his clients would never know, because what you did, you went into SameTime and you put your credentials in there, that, you know, your AOL credentials, so it logged in, you know, through the cloud for you. And I said, your clients will never know you're not using AOL Instant Messenger. You'll have the same functionality, but you can take a huge victory lap in the company because you stepped out and been a leader in cybersecurity. That's exactly what he did. And sure enough, that guy took a big victory lap and talked about how he was leading out in the company and being more secure by adopting a messaging platform that was much better than the one he was using. So that's an example of understanding why the business wanted to do this, and then trying to find a way to manage risk to a level the company was willing to accept. Another thing you've got to do when we talk about allies is you've got to find people in your organization, roles in your organization, that security is going to be important to them as well. And so if your organization has a chief legal counsel, whether it's an inside or an outside counsel, if you have an internal audit group or a compliance officer, those folks are folks that have an interest in cybersecurity as well. And so you want to spend time with them and explain to them what you're trying to accomplish and get feedback from them on that. And make sure that they're the ones that are going to be sitting in the room nodding yes when you're putting budget requests forward or when you're presenting an idea to the board. Because what's going to happen is if you're in there and you're the one speaking about it, they are going to look over particularly at that chief legal counsel, and they want to see this. And that's going to really affirm that this is something that others are on board with. So you're much more likely to get the support for the initiative and the funding that you're looking for to move that effort forward. What you do not want is you do not want to be in a situation where you are the only one in your organization that's really carrying the flag for cybersecurity. And I would tell you, if you find yourself in that scenario, you need to ask yourself a couple of questions. Number one, it is either a situation where you're at a company who really does not put a value on cybersecurity, or maybe you're not doing a good job of communicating such that you're getting your colleagues on board. It's one of those two situations. So you want to make sure that you are doing everything you can to communicate that message to get people on board. And if they're still not getting on board, then maybe as a security professional, you need to evaluate, hey, is this an organization that truly values what I bring to the table? And if it's not, I promise you there are plenty that will. And so you can look for an organization that does place the proper value on cybersecurity. And by the way, if you're in a role that isn't the cybersecurity leader, but you're a business leader in your company, I guess I'd challenge you to put that same hat on the other side and say, hey, do I put the right value on cybersecurity in my company? Am I listening to the IT leaders and cybersecurity leaders that are bringing stuff to me and telling me that these are things I need to be considering, and am I giving it a fair shake? So just make sure that you are indeed being open-minded and listening to the message. So we've got our credibility. We've built some allies in our organization. Now we really need to focus on the messaging to make sure that we hit home with what we're trying to say to our audience. One of the things you got to do is this. We have to recognize, of course, that the company's made investments in cybersecurity. They're spending money, and they've got employees that are working on cybersecurity. So we need to show the company what progress we've made and what return is being given to the organization in that regard. And so you do want to regularly assess your program's effectiveness and come up with a measure, whether it's a dashboard or something, to report out. So I used to tell my board, I would say, hey, this year the company made this investment in cybersecurity, and over the past year, here's what that's done. And I had a way to present that to them, to show them the progress that we've made and many metrics that we were measuring to show, reduction in various types of cybersecurity issues or increase in security posture, those types of things. What you don't want to do, however, is this: do not get caught up in tracking cybersecurity compliance in your organization. And here's what I mean. almost every organization on the planet has at least one regulation they need to comply with that relates to cybersecurity, whether it's HIPAA or PCI or FISMA or any one of the, there's a number of others. There's breach disclosure obligations that exist in states and things like that. If you are tracking your program's compliance, then you are probably subconsciously wiring your senior business leaders to think about security from a compliance standpoint. And those of us in cyber know that being compliant does not necessarily mean that we're secure, that we're managing risk to an acceptable level. So anytime your company comes up with, hey, how are we on HIPAA compliance? If you say, oh, you know what, we've done it, we're HIPAA compliant, the way they're going to hear it is, we're done. That sounds good. Let's stop running. We crossed the finish line. But as we all know in cyber, there's no stopping. We always have to keep running and keep moving forward because the bad guys are always evolving. And so you want to make sure that if they say, are we HIPAA compliant? You can say, you know what, our HIPAA compliance program is well aligned with the rules, but I need to remind you that there are a number of things that we have to keep doing in order to make sure that we don't suffer a breach, which would put us out of compliance or cause issues from a reputation or a financial loss standpoint. And so you want to focus really that conversation on security risk management and make sure that when they're asking about compliance, you do the best you can to spin it and point out that the goal is to manage risk to a level the organization's willing to accept. And if we do that, by our very nature, we will absolutely comply with any obligations we've got on the cyber side. The other thing you want to do is you want to have a way to evaluate your program against kind of a common framework. And there are plenty of frameworks out there. Hopefully many of you are already using one. There's, NIST CSF 853, PCI, there's High Trust, a number of types of frameworks that you can use. And any one of those will help. And they're important to use because none of us can think of everything in cyber. And we don't want to rely only on our own knowledge and skills, or we're going to leave out certain domains that we should be focusing on. But what you don't want to do is get caught up in framework paralysis. Because there are so many frameworks out there, one of the traps that a lot of security leaders fall into is saying, oh, well, here's where I am against NIST CSF, and here's where I am against High Trust, and here's where I am against PCI, and here's where I am, and it can be really confusing. Any one of those frameworks will help you manage risk to a level that's acceptable. So pick one and focus on that. And don't worry if it's the perfect framework, because there are mappings that down the line, if you pick NIST CSF and later you need to switch to ISO 27001 because your company goes international, it's real easy to use one of the freely available mappings to map your program over and switch. But what you don't want to do is end up trying to chase them all at the same time. It will get confusing and burdensome. And again, it will cloud that message to your leadership team. So pick a framework, use that to baseline your program, and move forward. All right, so just some tips there for those of you in security leadership roles. The last few minutes together, I want to take just a second and a couple of tips for success. One thing, make sure that your security policies are robust. Security policies form the underpinning of everything we do in cyber because they communicate management's expectations to our users about how they're supposed to interact with computer systems and handle data on the company's behalf. So don't neglect those security policies. Make sure you're regularly updating those to reflect management's expectations and the controls that you've got in place. If you hear nothing else today, the single most important control that organizations can put in place today, and my company does penetration testing for organizations all around the world, and I can tell you the single most important control you can have in place to prevent the most common types of attacks is multi-factor authentication. And the reason is, of course, because users are susceptible to clicking on links and giving out their passwords and things like that because they're human. And plus, if you think about it, these days, most users have so many passwords between the ones they have at work, and probably they have more than one in your organization. You probably don't have a single sign-on across everything. But then they got all their personal passwords as well. And so there's the temptation to use one password across multiple platforms or to write them down or those types of things. And all of that poses risk. That multi-factor authentication, which is using a token, something multi-factor, something something you have, something you are, right? Using two of those three factors, but not two of the same, it helps you achieve that goal of insulating yourself against the bad guy guessing or getting your employees' passwords. There's a company that on the internet does an analysis of the passwords that are used every year. How do they get the passwords that you and I use on the internet every year, you might ask? Well, it's because what happens is these companies that are compromised, like LinkedIn and Sony and some of these other companies you've read about over the years, when the bad guys get those databases, they use them for a few years for whatever purpose they got, and then they take all those passwords and they publish them in one of the underground sites so that others can use them as well. And so there's a company that goes out and does an analysis every year of the most common bad passwords that people use on the internet. And so what do you think the most common password was used in 2019 on the internet? Take a second and maybe write that down on a scratch pad next to your workstation. All right. The most commonly used password was 123456. And right after that, interestingly enough, is 123456789. Now, here's the funny thing about that. If you compare this list to the list from 2018, 123456 was number 1, but the next one, the 123456789, that was number 4. So it's moved up to number 2. And you know why that is? It's because our online sites are now forcing a longer password. And so what people are doing is simply choosing a few more of the numbers in succession to meet that minimum password length. So you can see the challenge that we face as cybersecurity leaders. If we've got users that are going to keep choosing passwords like what we've got on the screen, the bad guys are going to be able to guess them. And so we've got to have another mechanism that's going to keep the bad guys from being able to get in when they're choosing passwords like this. Now, you may say, at my organization, we put password rules in place. They could never choose one of these. And that's true, but they're going to choose something similar is the point. You see the scheme, the thinking that the users have. And one way or another, it might be able to be guessed, or more likely, they might click on a link and then it wouldn't matter. And that's where that multi-factor authentication is really going to come into play. All right, so our last point here is that you don't get caught up thinking that there's a silver bullet in security. There is no technology solution that will completely solve all your security problems. And don't mishear me, technology is an important part of a cybersecurity program. People, process, and technology, and those technology elements can be deployed to help minimize risk. But there's not one single thing you can do that's going to completely eliminate your exposure to security threats. So don't spend too much time looking for the silver bullet of security. Think of security in terms of an overall program and use technology components in conjunction with your security processes and controls and educating your people as a holistic security program. All right, so we'll have a couple minutes for questions, but as we come back to the very beginning, I ask you to think about this. How comfortable were you with your company's cybersecurity posture in your program today? And so we'll come back to, if you were comfortable with it, great. Keep pushing forward. But if you feel like there's some things that could be improved, perhaps some of the tips and thoughts that were shared today would be helpful to you as you look to continue to move your security program forward and gain additional support from others in the organization for funding the initiatives that need to be funded to help manage that risk to a level that we're willing to accept. So I promised you that I would tell you how to get a copy of the book. And so on the screen there, you can see a link to a page where if you'd like to, you can click on the link, and again, they'll put it in the show notes, and we'll get a book out to you at the address that you provide in the very near future. So with that, I will hand the floor back to Jeff, and I'll be glad to take any questions that may have come in.
Awesome. Mark, thank you so much. Appreciate it. We have one person who's expressed an interest in the book, so we'll make sure we'll put that link in there so that way we can get that out to folks and they can request a copy of it. So we have a couple questions here. The first one is, Mark, you touched upon passwords. What are your thoughts on the new NI?
The new NI?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with if they're using an acronym. I don't know.
I think it's an acronym, and I got to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure either. So, John, if you want to pop into the chat more specifics about that, we'll get to it at the end. We'll move on to the next one for the time being, if that works. So the next one comes in, picking a framework like NIST is a good start. Do companies determine their own level of framework compliance, for example, 75%? And how do you communicate that compliance to the board and leadership?
That's a great question. Yeah, so yeah, framework is a good start. And I would say that, yes, if you're lucky enough to have someone in your organization that has some cyber acumen, and I recognize that based on the size of your company, you may not have a full-time person that focuses on cyber. You may be the IT leader who wears multiple hats. I get that. But if you've got someone in your organization that you feel comfortable has enough acumen, then yes, a good place to start is to do your own analysis against that framework. And if you look at like NIST CSF, it takes a maturity score approach. And so it looks at things like, do you have a policy? Well, you can get some points for that. And do you have a process? Well, there's points for that. So a good place to start is something like that. If you using a different framework like ISO or NIST 853 or PCI, you could start with a kind of a yes or a no. Do we have a control to meet that or not? You know, ISO has 150 some odd controls, and it could simply be a, I believe we do, or I believe we don't. So that's a place to start, would be to simply with that. But ultimately, what you ought to do then, after you've done it internally, it is responsible for companies to periodically bring in an external party to come in and vet that. Someone that's a trusted party to your organization that can come in and bring that objective view and evaluate you. You know, the benefit that organizations like that bring, like, you know, like what we do at LBMC, is simply being able to say, hey, here's what we see at other organizations in the similar industry and things like that, and help you think about things in a broader picture than just your organization, and also help with the messaging. But a great place to start is to have someone in your organization use that and go through and do a yes or a no, an on or an off, if you will, to start.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. So apparently I went a little too quick here because John did have 2 questions. So let me combine them together here because it makes perfect sense now. So Mark, you touched upon passwords. What are your thoughts on the new NIST suggestion of 12 characters using passphrases and not forcing password changes?
Yes. Okay, great. Well, you know, this is interesting, and this is, you could spend an entire conference on password entropy, and I know that's super geeky. Nobody would necessarily want to sit through that, I wouldn't think. But I would tell you that what we know is this. When we ask users, when we tell users to choose a 7-character password, that's generally what they're going to choose. And because of the speed of computing these days, it is easier and easier to actually brute force or deconstruct those passwords using some password tools that you can get, especially the way that Windows handles the password encryption, if you will, and masking. And so using the longer passwords but changing them less frequently, very good idea. And that's technically what we're advising our clients, is choose a passphrase. As a matter of fact, had we had more time, I actually had some examples to share with you that would have given you an example of how to take what used to be a good password and migrate it to a good passphrase. But I think that's a great idea. And many of the organizations we work with are decreasing the frequency of change. Most people were typically doing quarterly changes, but they're going to maybe changing twice a year, but having a 15 to 18 character password or passphrase. And I can tell you that from an attacker standpoint, it is proving much harder to compromise those than it is to compromise the 7 and 8 character passwords that were in place before.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. Next question we have comes from Mike, and he says, in addition to using Qualys, what software do you suggest that is current in 2020?
Well, Qualys, of course, is like vulnerability scanning, something like that. And so there are many tools like Qualys that you could use, any of the commercial tools. There are some freeware tools that could be used. But again, you'd want to have people in your organization that have the right acumen for that. So when you're speaking, you know, Qualys, vulnerability scanning, I would say other things you ought to be looking at using outside of vulnerability scanning would be things like identity management tools to help you manage the identities in your organization. You'd probably be wanting to looking at things like password vaults, particularly for your privileged accounts. Privileged account management is one of the biggest challenges that companies face, you know, sharing those administrator level passwords across multiple people while still keeping accountability for that. So there's software in that space that I would suggest you might look at as well. And then ultimately, really, when you do your risk assessment, and every organization should be doing an annual cybersecurity risk assessment, your risk assessment will tip you off, if it's done properly, on where you might need additional software tool investments. So it's hard for me to say, there's so many good solutions out there, different things to think about. It's hard for me to point you to any particular tools without seeing the results of the risk assessment that might indicate, because nobody has an unlimited amount of money to spend on cyber. So you want to make sure that if you're going to spend money or expend resources on cybersecurity, you're getting the best bang for your buck, highest and best use in addressing those riskiest items first.